She walked into the bank in her Sunday best, expecting to deposit a check from her son. Instead, she watched it get shredded in front of her eyes. What the teller didn't know, her son wasn't just anyone, he was the face on their lobby screen. And what happened next changed everything. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move, you challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. It was the kind of morning that carried too much hope for what it was about to ruin. The air in Savannah, Georgia, was soft with early sunlight warming the sidewalks that lined the historic Beaulieu Avenue. Birds whistled over the quiet hum of lawn sprinklers, and storefronts were just beginning to wake. Marlene Hughes stepped out of her small craftsman bungalow with the kind of grace that turned heads without asking to. At 65, she was the portrait of quiet dignity. Her lavender church dress, pressed and deliberate, fluttered gently around her knees. She wore the gold earrings she had received on her 30th wedding anniversary. Her purse, aged leather and worn at the handle, held nothing more than her ID, a lipstick she rarely used, and an envelope that made her hands shake. It was a check, one she hadn't asked for, one she almost didn't cash. Her son Elijah had sent it the week before, $9,800. To help out, he said casually over the phone. Her water heater had gone out, and she'd mentioned it in passing. She hadn't meant to turn it into anything. But by the next day, a courier had arrived with the envelope along with a handwritten note in Elijah's neat block. Letters. Ma, this isn't charity. This is thanks. Cash it. Elijah Hughes, founder and CEO of Hughes Renewables, one of the nation's fastest growing solar infrastructure firms, had always been that kind of son. Quietly generous, painfully private. The kind of man who'd survived boardrooms that saw his skin before his skill, who never posted about success. Because success to him was still making sure his mother never had to ask. And yet, as Marlene stepped through the glass doors of First Dominion Bank, she didn't feel like the mother of anyone important. The building had changed since she last came. New LED screens lined the back wall, glowing with corporate slogans and community partnership announcements. She had banked here for over 20 years. She remembered when it was a family credit union, the tellers knew your name, and the floors didn't smell like machine oil and disinfectant. But now it was slick, fast, cold. She approached the counter and waited. The young teller on the left tan blazer, almond nails, the kind of professional who never looked up unless necessary, finally acknowledged her. Yes, the woman said flatly. Marlene offered a small smile. I'd like to deposit this check, please. The teller took it without expression, but the moment her eyes fell on the numbers and signature, something in her face shifted. Is this yours? The teller asked, her tone already lined with suspicion. Yes, Marlene said gently. It's from my son. The teller didn't hide her disbelief. She turned the check over, squinting at the name. Elijah Hughes, she read aloud slowly. And who is he exactly? My son Marlene repeated firmer this time. He owns a renewable energy firm. The pause was cold, the kind that isn't long in seconds, but long in judgment. This is a large amount, the teller finally said. Almost 10,000. I'm going to need to verify this. I can give you his number, or even. But before Marlene could finish, the woman reached across, picked up the check like it was soiled, and fed it into the shredder beside her desk. The whirring of the blades swallowed the silence and then spit it back out as something sharper. It wasn't just the check that was torn apart, it was something deeper, something older, something Marlene had been carrying for a lifetime. "Excuse me," she said, breath short. "If it's legit," the teller said dismissively, "he can issue another one. But we don't process suspicious deposits, especially from people who can't verify the source." A man in line behind Marlene scoffed. A woman in heels whispered, "Unbelievable." And yet the teller moved on, waving the next customer forward, like the moment hadn't meant anything at all. Marlene stood frozen. Her legs wanted to move, but her dignity needed her to stand. She stepped back slowly, gripping the edge of her purse. The lavender sleeves of her dress suddenly felt too bright. She walked over to the waiting area and sat unsure of whether her legs would hold her if she didn't. Her hands trembled. Her breath fought to steady. She hadn't been treated like that since, well, not since she was a teenager in the Mississippi Delta, back when signs still told her which water fountain to use. What struck her wasn't just the humiliation, it was how casual it had been, how clean, how professional, like a silent sentence handed down without trial. She looked up at the bank's digital screen above the entrance. It was rotating ads, loan options, savings accounts, small business partnerships, and then, like a strange twist of fate, there he was. Elijah's face. Sharp suit. Calm, serious gaze. The caption below the photo read, "Elijah Hughes, CEO of Hughes Renewables, proud partner of First Dominion Bank." Marlene's breath caught in her throat. The screen changed again. Another ad, then another. But the damage was already done, not to her, but to them. And this time, the teller wasn't shredding anything. She had shredded trust. And trust has a way of bleeding where everyone can see it. Marlene Hughes sat in the stiff vinyl chair, hands folded in her lap, like a schoolgirl waiting to be scolded. The chill of the lobby had begun to sink into her skin, but the deeper cold came from within the cold of being doubted, dismissed, and discarded. She stared at her lap, her lavender dress soft against trembling fingers, and wondered how many other women had sat exactly where she was now, carrying truth in their hands, only to have it mistaken for a lie. A teller had not just shredded a check, she had shredded proof of love, of care, of decades of hard-earned dignity. Marlene had been many things in her life. A widow before 40, a nurse for 29 years, a church choir leader, a mother, a voter, a woman who paid off her mortgage a year early. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Not to the young woman behind the counter. Not to the eyes that had stared at her with quiet suspicion. All that mattered was her appearance, her age, her tone, as if all those things added up to risk. No one rushed to help her. No manager emerged. The woman behind the counter moved on to the next customer, with practiced indifference, smiling, now joking even. Marlene watched the performance unfold, how easy it was to switch tones, depending on who stood at the counter. She remembered telling Elijah, back when he was 10, and winning spelling bees, that the world wouldn't always clap for him. That some rooms would shrink the moment he walked in. She hated being right. She was still lost in thought when she noticed people whispering. A man near the coffee machine gestured toward the screen above the lobby, the one rotating images and slogans. Another customer glanced from the monitor to Marlene and then back again. Something had shifted, not in her, but around her. Then came the sharp clack of polished shoes on tile. A man in a blue suit, mid-40s, confident in the way only someone with a key card and corner office could be strode out from a back hallway. Marlene recognized him. His name was printed on the brass plaque next to the glass-walled office behind the counter. Stephen Greer, branch manager. She had seen him once or twice before, always chatting with younger clients or slipping out with a golf bag. He had never spoken to her until now. "Mrs. Hughes?" he asked, voice soft but urgent. Marlene looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "Yes, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Could we speak in my office?" His tone had changed, suddenly formal, almost reverent. His gaze flicked to the screen above them and then quickly away. The image on display, Elijah Hughes, smiling in his dark suit beside a First Dominion logo, glowed quietly behind them like an indictment. Marlene rose slowly. Her legs ached, not from age, but from restraint. She followed Greer through the glass doors, past the desks and screens and private conversations. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Inside, he gestured toward a chair. She remained standing. "I want to start by sincerely apologizing," he said. "We had no idea." "No," she interrupted, voice low and steady. "You had no interest in knowing?" Greer hesitated. "That's not what I meant. But it's what happened." He swallowed hard. "The teller Danielle, she's relatively new. Still in training, technically. I assure you, her actions don't reflect our values." Marlene tilted her head. "Your teller destroyed a legitimate check from a client whose face you're proud to display 5 feet from the door. She didn't call to verify. She didn't ask for ID. She just decided I didn't belong. So tell me, Mr. Greer, what does reflect your values?" The question hung in the air. I don't know how to answer that," he admitted. Marlene sat at last, slow and deliberate. "Then maybe that's the problem." She wasn't interested in apologies that came only after exposure. She was interested in the rot that lived quietly in the corners of polite systems, the kind of rot that smiled when it said, "Next, please," but rotted just the same. Greer leaned forward. "Your son is Mr. Hughes is an important client. If there's anything we can do." She met his eyes. "You're not trying to fix the damage. You're trying to manage the fallout." He blinked. "I've been banking here for over 20 years, she continued. "And in less than 5 minutes, your employee managed to erase every ounce of trust I thought I had. You can't shred a check and expect me to tape it back together with an apology." Outside the glass wall, more eyes were on them now. The bank, so confident in its processes, was suddenly aware of its fragility. Inside, Greer was nodding furiously, trying to regain control. "We'll cover the check in full immediately, and corporate will be informed. I promise you that." Marlene didn't respond. She reached into her purse, retrieved a small notepad, and tore off a page. "This is Elijah's number. If you want to explain this, do it to him. I'm done here." Greer took the paper with 2 hands, as if it might burn him. She rose again, the lavender of her dress catching the late morning light through the glass. As she stepped out of the office, the digital screen changed once more. There was Elijah again, this time standing beside the mayor, a quote below him in bold white text. "Progress means everyone, not just the privileged." The irony was sharper than the shredder's teeth. Marlene walked past the teller counter. Danielle was no longer there. Her chair was empty. Another teller glanced at Marlene. unsure whether to look apologetic or afraid. Marlene gave neither the satisfaction. She opened the bank's glass door, stepped into the sunlight, and paused for a long breath. They had shredded a piece of paper, but what they really tore apart was something much harder to replace. And now, it wasn't just about a mother and her check. It was about what that check represented and the systems that refused to see her as worthy of it. The hum of Elijah's Tesla faded as he eased into a parking spot outside the First Dominion Bank in downtown Atlanta. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that didn't threaten rain, but held weight in the air. Nonetheless, like the city itself, was holding its breath. He hadn't planned to come in person. His assistant had already sent an email to the bank's executive team that morning. But emails weren't enough, not this time. Not after what his mother endured, while wearing her best lavender dress, not after a teller looked at her with doubt where there should have been respect. When Elijah pushed through the bank's glass doors, heads turned not because he was famous, but because everyone already knew. The story had outpaced the building. It had leapt from whispered disbelief in the lobby to Twitter threads and morning radio shows. Someone had snapped a photo of Marlene sitting in the waiting area the day before, hunched slightly, her hands folded over her purse, like she was bracing against something invisible. Next to it, they'd posted a screenshot of the bank's rotating digital ad with Elijah's name emblazoned across the bottom. The caption read, "They shredded a check from this man's mother, then aired his face on their screen." In under 24 hours, it had been shared over 70,000 times. Stephen Greer, the branch manager, was already waiting. His smile was stiff, his eyes darting to the onlookers who pretended not to watch. A second employee hovered awkwardly near the teller counter. Greer took one step forward and offered his hand. "Mr. Hughes, thank you for Elijah didn't take the hand. You know why I'm here." Greer cleared his throat. "We deeply regret the treatment your mother received. There's no excuse. We're already reviewing staff procedures. And where is the teller who destroyed the check?" Elijah asked, cutting in. His voice was calm, but carried weight like a courtroom had settled. "She's been placed on leave pending review." "Leave," Elijah repeated. "Not termination." "We have to follow internal processes," Greer began, but Elijah shook his head. "So your internal process is to protect her paycheck before protecting my mother's dignity." A sharp silence fell across the lobby. Conversations paused. Phones were slowly raised, some pretending to check emails, but clearly recording. "This isn't just about my mother," Elijah continued. "This is about how easily you believed a black woman in her 60s, someone who's banked here for 2 decades, couldn't possibly be connected to success. That speaks volumes." Greer shifted sweat forming along his brow. "Mr. Hughes, we're committed to addressing this. The corporate team is your corporate team. Plays my face on that screen," Elijah said, turning to gesture at the bank's ad monitor, where his keynote from the Atlanta Economic Equity Conference now flashed on loop. "They use my image to show diversity and progress. Meanwhile, your staff sees my mother and assumes fraud." From the corner of the room, a woman stepped out from behind the teller row. Elijah recognized her older kind-eyed. She was the one who had approached Marlene quietly the day before. "She didn't even ask for ID," the woman said softly. "Didn't pick up the phone. She just shredded it." Elijah looked at her. "What's your name, Denise Carter?" "I've worked here 15 years. I watched it happen, and I'm ashamed I didn't speak up sooner." He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and alliance. The others in the room were quiet, But something in the silence had shifted. It was no longer polite avoidance, it was recognition. Elijah turned back to Greer. I'm not here for an apology. I'm here with this. He pulled out a folded paper and handed it over. That's a list of all our nonprofit and corporate partners who bank with First Dominion through Hughes Renewal. You want to keep those relationships? Then this doesn't end with one disciplinary review. Greer scanned the list and visibly paled. There were over 20 names, some with contracts worth 6 and 7 figures. Also, Elijah added, tell your PR department not to write another soulless statement. Don't say you regret the experience. Say what happened. Name it. Or people like my mother will keep getting erased by politeness. Greer fumbled a nod, overwhelmed. We'll get this to corporate immediately. Elijah glanced at the screen once more. The quote from his last keynote flashed below his image. Equity isn't a speech. It's a standard. The irony twisted like a knot in his chest. He turned toward the gathered customers, many of whom were now watching openly. My mother is one of the most disciplined, selfless people I've ever known, he said. She's the reason I'm on that screen. She made sacrifices you can't fit into a resume. And when she finally accepted help from her own son, you treated her like a criminal. No one moved. Not even Greer. And if that's how you treat a woman whose son's face is 5 feet from your front door, Elijah added, how are you treating the people with no screen at all? With that, he walked out, not to cheers, not to applause, but to a silence that felt louder than anything else in the room. Outside, the gray sky cracked with light, and Elijah stood for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the cold bite at his fingers. He didn't check his phone. He didn't need to. He knew the world was already watching. But he wasn't finished. Because it wasn't about revenge. It was about something harder, something slower. He was building something deeper than a response. He was building reckoning, and from there, maybe finally repair. Marlene Hughes had spent most of her life believing in the strength of silence. Her grace was not forged in loud declarations or protest signs. It was shaped in kitchens filled with steam and late-night shifts where dignity was worn like a second skin. She'd endured more than most would ever know, not because she accepted injustice, but because she'd been raised to survive it quietly. But now, her silence had become a headline. She hadn't watched the full clip of Elijah's visit to the bank, only pieces shown on television. But she could feel the aftershocks in the way neighbors paused longer at her gate, in how local reporters left business cards in her mailbox, and in the way a little girl on the sidewalk whispered, "That's her," as she passed. It made her both proud and unbearably exposed. The morning after Elijah's public stand, Marlene sat at her kitchen table, folding clothes with mechanical patience. The hum of the news in the background was familiar now, anchors saying her name, retelling her story in clean-clipped voices. They described the incident as a banking mishap, a case of mistaken judgment, or the now ubiquitous phrase, alleged racial bias. But it wasn't alleged to Marlene. It was her life. She looked down at the church dress she had carefully ironed that morning. It lay across her lap, like a memory, no longer soft with comfort, but heavy with the weight of what it now represented. She hadn't worn it since the day of the incident. Somehow, it felt altered, like even fabric could remember humiliation. Elijah had called 3 times that morning. She'd picked up the third. "Ma," he said softly, "the press wants to talk to you directly. A sit-down, but only if you're ready." Marlene hesitated. What for? To tell your side, not just what happened, but what it means. She looked out the window, watching as a neighbor raked leaves into neat rows. I don't want to become a symbol. You already are, Elijah said. But now, you get to decide what kind. Later that week, they sat down with Dana Wu, a local reporter known for quiet interviews that let people breathe. The setting was Marlene's living room, framed by handmade curtains and an old clock that had ticked through every chapter of Elijah's childhood. Mrs. Hughes Dana began gently, "When you entered that bank, what did you expect?" Marlene smiled faintly, her voice steady. "To deposit a check, that's all." And when they destroyed it, Marlene looked down at her hands. "I thought, so this is what they see when they look at me. Not a mother, not a customer, not a woman who's never bounced a check in her life, but a lie waiting to be disproven." She paused. It wasn't the money. It was how quickly they decided I didn't belong. The clip aired that evening. In it, Marlene wasn't angry. She wasn't even emotional. That's what made it powerful. She was calm, clear, human. And the world listened. Within hours, the interview had circulated across social media platforms, accompanied by comments like, "She speaks with so much grace," and "This reminds me of my mom." People shared their own stories, moments when their parents or grandparents had been disrespected in quiet, crushing ways. Elijah watched the numbers climb, but it wasn't the views that mattered. It was the voices, new ones, honest ones finally being heard. A teacher in Kansas wrote to him, "I played your mother's interview for my civics class. My students are asking better questions now." But even as the public praised her poise, Marlene sat in her kitchen and wondered what it would have been like if the screen hadn't been playing Elijah's face that day. Would they have apologized? Would anyone have believed her? She told Elijah one evening. Don't let them rewrite it. Don't let them turn it into a misunderstanding. It wasn't. He nodded. I won't. The bank issued a second apology, this one longer, more carefully worded, and slightly more human. It named her. It acknowledged what happened. But it still didn't name the teller. Or say the word that everyone else already had: racism. Marlene didn't comment on the apology. She didn't need to. Instead, she accepted an invitation to speak just once at a financial literacy event for seniors. It wasn't a media circus, just a community gathering inside a church basement where folding chairs and bad coffee gave it the warmth of truth. She didn't lecture. She shared. When I was 24, she said, I walked into a bank to open my first account. I had a job. I had ID. They told me I didn't qualify. I didn't argue. I just left. Thought maybe I'd done something wrong. The room was quiet. They never explained. Just looked at me like I was hoping for something I didn't deserve. She paused. I've been proper all my life. Polite. Responsible. But that day in the bank, it wasn't about how I carried myself. It was about what they assumed. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. A man in the back whispered, Same thing happened to my wife. Marlene's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I didn't speak up to be famous, she said. I spoke up because the next person might not have a son on a screen. That line would be quoted in newspapers, on podcasts, and in city council meetings. But to Marlene, it was just the truth. Back at home, she placed the shredded remnants of the check returned to her in a sealed envelope into a small box beside old family photos. Not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. That even paper can carry the weight of proof. And sometimes, A mother's quiet voice can echo louder than any screen. By the time the story of Marlene Hughes had crossed state lines and entered national discourse, it was no longer just about a check. It had become a mirror, one held up to a nation that too often looked away from the quiet compounding pain of ordinary people who bore injustice with grace because shouting rarely worked for them. The footage from the community event, Marlene's calm voice filling a church basement, her words steady as stone, had been shared more than 2 million times. Not for its flash, but for its honesty. She wasn't a celebrity. She didn't raise her voice. But what she said struck a nerve in a country that claimed to know better, yet too often acted like it didn't. Journalists, organizers, and everyday Americans began asking the same question. If this could happen to her, a loyal customer and mother of one of the bank's most celebrated clients, what happens to those who don't have a public platform or a powerful last name? Elijah understood the momentum had shifted. What began as a defense of his mother's dignity was now a demand for systemic reflection. He stood before cameras with more intention, now not out of anger, but out of duty. Each microphone, each interview, each headline wasn't about amplifying outrage. It was about deepening awareness. He spoke at forums on financial equity, met with community bankers, and even addressed a Senate subcommittee on discrimination in commercial services. But through it all, he made one thing clear. Don't turn this into a feel-good moment. This isn't about a happy ending. It's about the people still being quietly denied. The Bradford Initiative. The foundation Elijah launched in his mother's name began with 2 rooms above a barber shop. Now it had grown into a citywide network offering resources for the elderly, financial literacy workshops, and bias training for bank employees. Not as a punishment, but as a pathway. Marlene visited the space once a week. She'd sit in the corner, folding mailers or helping seniors fill out forms, sipping weak coffee from a floral mug someone had labeled Mama H. She never asked for attention, but visitors often sought her out just to shake her hand or say, "You reminded me of my mother." Outside the bank where it all began, flowers still appeared at the steps. Some brought notes, others their stories. One card read, "They looked at me the same way they looked at you. Thank you for showing them we matter." The bank's corporate office had issued another statement. This one was longer, humbler, more specific. They acknowledged Marlene by name. They admitted fault. They announced new diversity leadership policy overhauls and dedicated outreach programs to rebuild trust in communities they had long taken for granted. Elijah, however, was cautious. Policy change without culture change is just paper, he said. We don't need better apologies. We need better assumptions. But the real change wasn't happening in boardrooms or press releases. It was in the whispers shared between strangers in line at banks and the teachers, using Marlene's story to teach compassion in the bank employees who now paused before jumping to conclusions. It was in the mother who brought her daughter into the credit union for the first time and said, "This is what safe looks like." For Marlene, it was simpler than that. Change was the feeling of walking into a room and not being second-guessed. It was the joy of knowing her son didn't just succeed in business. He succeeded in giving others a chance to be seen. One evening, she sat with Elijah on her porch. The crickets buzzed, and the world felt slower than usual. "You sure you're not tired of all this yet?" Elijah asked, nudging her gently. "I've been tired since 1989, she chuckled. "But tired don't mean done." He smiled. "You've said that before, and I'll keep saying it till someone listens. There was silence for a while. Then she added, I never wanted to be famous. I just wanted to be treated fair. That's not asking too much, is it? No, Ma Elijah, said, his voice soft. It never was. What started in a sterile bank lobby became a spark, a reckoning not powered by rage, but by resilience. One mother's quiet endurance had awakened a national conscience, and her story became a map for every person who'd ever been made to feel small, despite standing tall. Marlene Hughes didn't shout to be heard. She simply told the truth, and the world finally listened. Marlene Hughes never asked for the spotlight. She didn't go to that bank in San Francisco to make a statement or spark a national conversation. All she wanted was to deposit a check, one her son had sent her, out of gratitude and love. But what should have been a simple transaction unraveled into a moment of deep humiliation, a moment that exposed something far bigger than one woman's experience. It revealed how quickly dignity can be dismissed when unconscious bias walks into the room before you do. From the shredded check to the cold waiting room, from the ignored requests to the impersonal apologies, Marlene endured it all with quiet strength. Yet it was not just her pain that moved the nation. It was her composure, her calm refusal to be broken, her ability to speak the truth without bitterness. And when her son Elijah stepped forward, not with outrage, but with clarity and purpose, he carried not only his mother's voice, but the voices of so many who had been overlooked and disrespected in silence. This story could have ended in anger. Instead, it grew into action. Together, Marlene and Elijah transformed hurt into healing. They launched workshops, initiatives, and conversations. They challenged institutions not through protest, but through presence. They didn't just demand change, they modeled what it looked like. What began as one mother's mistreatment became a wake-up call for an entire system urging people across the country to reevaluate how we treat each other, not based on wealth, appearance, or assumptions, but on shared humanity. The lesson here runs deeper than just race or class. It's about seeing the value in people before they have to prove it. It's about the dangers of judging character based on clothing, skin tone, or a last name. And it's about the extraordinary power of ordinary people who choose to speak up not just for themselves, but for those still waiting in silence. In today's world, where so many are dismissed without a second thought, this story reminds us dignity isn't something you earn by status, it's something you're owed by right. Marlene didn't want recognition, she wanted respect. And that makes her story not only unforgettable, but essential. So if this story moved you, if it made you think about the quiet strength in someone you know, or reminded you of a time when you wish someone had spoken up, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel to support stories that matter, stories that reflect not just what's wrong with the world, but what's possible when we choose to respond with courage, compassion, and truth. Because sometimes all it takes is one voice, one moment, one check, shredded, but not silenced to change everything. Stay with us. More stories like this are on the way.